tonight to have a wildlife biologist. He's retired now, that's why we get him, who used to work for the Park Service and the Forest Service. And he was able to help with the Wolverine study that they did, and so he has some wonderful, interesting stuff to tell us about Wolverine. And maybe other things too. If you have questions, he's a fount of knowledge. This is Rick Yates.
Okay, good evening, and welcome to this beautiful venue here on the Blackfoot Reservation, in the land of the shining mountains and backbone of the world and the heart of the two medicines. So, one of the things I'm going to, well, mostly what I'm going to talk about is something I have learned a bit about is Wolverines. They're a very interesting animal that I've had the honor actually to study, and I want to share with you some of the things that I've learned over the years, 30 years of working in Glacier and around them. Wolverines are a fur bearer that were heavily sought after, mostly for their fur. They have a very thick coat. In the winter, their fur doesn't hold frost, and so it was used to like parkas that were used in the far north. Very desirable fur. Currently, there is no trapping of wolverines in the lower 48 states. Montana was the last state that allowed trapping of wolverines, and that ended about 10 years ago, I believe. A lot of people, well, some people have seen wolverines. A lot of people know what they look like, but probably not everybody has heard one. That's a female. Female Wolverine. So the males weigh about 30 pounds, the females weigh about 20 pounds in this part of the world, and they sound like a 300-pound grizzly bear. Right? So it's very humbling experience to work with these animals. Go ahead to the next slide. Wolverines are fitted for more alpine type of habitats. They have very large feet for the size of their animal. Their feet are about the size of your hand. They have 5 toes. They have sharp claws on each toe. They have relatively long legs once you take away the thick fur. And but they also have an overdeveloped jaw bone and muscular, mandibular muscles and teeth. So, and those are adapted for eating frozen meat and for crushing bones. So they can crush the bones of elk and actually consume those bones and live off of that, as other predators aren't able to do. So they're have been called lots of different things. Devil bear, skunk bear, carcajou is a French term. Devil of the North. Lots of different names for this critter that mostly came from trapping lore. They were notorious for raiding trap lines, for breaking into cabins and meat caches and destroying trappers' wares. Can that be focus a little bit better? And but their scientific name is gulo gulo. So gulo in Latin means glutton. So they're gluttons. It's all about food, right? So we're learning more about them. And one of the things we learned is that wolverines pretty much live by their nose. They have a refined sense of smell. They can detect carcass under 30 feet of avalanche debris. They've been known to tunnel into avalanche debris to feed on carcasses. They can track another wolverine days later across the snowscape and know exactly which wolverine they're following. And they're also they're very good predators. They live a lot on carrion, but they can also prey on other animals, and they can take down prey much larger than themselves. Caribou, deer around here, and there's even been documentation of a wolverine killing a moose that was trapped in a tree limb. So they can take down very large prey. They have very strong jaws, so they can crush what is fun. Wolverines are circumpolar in the northern hemisphere. They live in Russia, in northern Europe, Canada, and Alaska. Not sure about Greenland. Okay. In North America, Alaska and Canada have healthy populations. The historic range went farther to the east and south in this area, and then the northern tier states had some wolverine there, but of course that's changed in the last 200 years. So they also occur following the Rocky Mountain chain. They pretty much define the Yellowstone to Yukon ecoregion. They follow the Rocky Mountain chain. The lower 48 has a population of about 300 wolverines. There's a small bunch in the northern Cascades. And there was actually a study done there that just ended here a few years ago. Next, in the Intermountain West, that's kind of the Wolverine Central for the lower 48 in the Rocky Mountains, and here's the next one. These island populations, we did our study in Glacier. The first study of wolverines that ever occurred in the lower 48 was in the South Fork of the Flathead River, which is just across the divide. That was done, started in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was done by Maurice Hornacher and Howard Hash. And at that time, they were limited, of course, in the technology that was available to them, but it was groundbreaking work on wolverines in the lower 48. Since that time, there have been studies in central Idaho, in this area by Jeff Copeland in the 90s. There was a study done in the Pioneer Mountains here. Wildlife Conservation Society had a study. There was a long-term study done in south central Montana in the Madison range. And then there was a study done in Yellowstone, and another study in central Idaho. It pretty much encompassed this entire area with winter recreation. So one of the things that I like to point out is that most of the wolverine populations in the Intermountain West are island type populations. So they're in the mountain ranges that are scattered within the Intermountain West, and that's it's particularly important because there needs to be connectivity between these isolated populations so that they can have a diversity in their population. This is an interesting photo that I found today, actually. If you'll notice, this is Swift Current Lake, the mini glacier valley. I'm sure a lot of people have been there. If you'll notice, there's no hotel. Across here. So this picture was actually taken in 1911, just after the Park Service, or just after the Glacier National Park was established. The Glacier National Park was established in 1910. The National Park Service didn't come into being until 1916. But at the time this photo was taken, wolverines were pretty much extirpated or gone from this area. They were trapped out. There were none here. None that anybody ever recorded during that period. So, next. So it took years for wolverines actually to start to come back, probably from Canada. They started moving in. Like any predator, they have a very slow reproductive rate. So it takes generations for them to build back their populations. One of the things that probably had a lot to do with wolverines actually not coming back into any numbers in Glacier National Park until the 1960s was these 1080 poison stations. So the federal government put out bait stations laced with poison, this 1080 poison from, and I found this in the park records, from 1948 to 1954, they pretty much, different years, ranked the boundary of the park with this poison to kill predators. Back in those days, there were two kinds of animals. There were good animals and bad animals. So, elk, deer, Bambi, they were all good. And anything that ate those animals was bad. So, killing predators was big business back in those days. So, consequently, I believe it took quite a long time for wolverines to reestablish in the park. Observations increased in the 60s and 70s, and then into the 80s, and now Glacier Park is a great place to see wolverines. A lot of people see them there. So it took a while for wolverines to crawl out of that hole that they were in. They are ranked in Montana. They're considered a sensitive species. They're rare and potentially at risk. That's how they're rated by the state. The global ranking is a G4 ranking. It's rare. The populations are apparently secure, but they are suspected of decline. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a ranking right now, and it's a proposed species. There have been several different lawsuits, basically, that have tried to get wolverines listed as a threatened or endangered species in the lower 48 states, and they have never gone through as of yet. That's been going on for probably 15 years or more, these different lawsuits. But the Fish and Wildlife Service has ranked them as proposed, saying, there's not enough information, that kind of stuff. So, in 2002, I was lucky enough to get included in a Wolverine study in Glacier National Park. The principal investigator was Jeff Copeland. We worked for the Rocky Mountain Research Station. We in no way did all the work ourselves. We had some dedicated technicians, and we had a host of volunteers that worked in the winter months in terrible conditions, hauling dead things around, and we had a very successful study. So Glacier Park was partially chosen for a study because it has a lot of tree line type of habitat, and that is the preferred habitat of wolverines. So what you're seeing here is just above and below tree line. That's all just prime wolverine habitat, and Glacier has a lot of it. So the next one, if you've been to Logan Pass is a very good place to see wolverines, but it's also prime habitat for wolverines. One of the things that they require is a viable population of large mammals, ungulates, elk, deer, sheep, goats, those sorts of things. That's that biomass food source is what wolverines require to have a healthy population as well. So when we came to Glacier, I had been working here for a while, but when we came here to do our study, we looked at where wolverine tracks had been documented for decades and decided that's where we would concentrate our studies. I had done some track surveys of winter carnivores in the 90s, and so we went to the Mid-Glacier Valley. These are wolverine tracks. We went to the Mid-Glacier Valley and we built traps, these log box traps. They're a very simple design, really. They're just big boxes, and when the wolverines pulled on the bait, the lid came down, and there they were. They took about a day to build these things. So we had 12 of these throughout the park. And one of the things we liked about them was that they were made out of native materials. Previous wolverine studies had used metal drums to capture wolverines. Of course, they would break teeth or cut themselves. And so we liked this design because if they did chew on them, and if they were left for very long, they could chew their way out. And That happened a couple of times, but we had transmitters on the traps, so we knew when we had caught something. We didn't know what it was until we got there, but we usually get there within a couple hours. So we only trapped in the winter because of bears, and bears tend to make a mess of traps, so we had to wait till they were sleeping. And man, our traps, a lot of maintenance on these traps, but okay. But we operated the 12 traps for 5 different winters. We had 1,695 trap nights. We captured 28 individuals, a total of 162 times. We had 42 lynx captures. A lot of those were probably the same lynx. I'm sure they were the same lynx. But one of the aspects of these traps was that we could have multiple captures of the same individual. M1 was our adult male in the mini Glacier Valley, and he was totally trapped wise. We caught him in 2003, and every year since, but in 2006 alone, we caught him 8 times. So that is very important for our study because we were able to switch transmitters on him, switch batteries and keep him transmitted the whole winter. So it worked out really well. This is Wolverine in a trap. This is she would have 5. Actually, my son named this one. But she's a young female. Okay, we'll go back and click on her.
Oh, wow.
So when they say quick hatch, you can kind of like, okay. Anyway, this is kind of the behavior of the Wolverines, except if they were younger, they would cower at the other end of the trap. But they would try to intimidate you, what are you about? They're not really afraid that much. And then we would drug them in the traps. We drug them and put these GPS collars on them. And this is the M3, he got an ear tag as well. This is one of our volunteers, Buck Hassan. He was instrumental in a lot of the work on the project. He's a good guy to have on your side in the wintertime. So the GPS collars were what they call the store on board. So all the satellite locations that we got were stored in the collar themselves. And this is, sometimes we get them back, we were lucky if we could get them back. They would be kind of torn to shreds. So we worked with the manufacturers. This was some of the first GPS collars that had been put on Wolverines. We worked with manufacturers to try to get a collar that was smaller and more comfortable, that fit the Wolverines well because they have a very large neck. And if they wanted to take the collar off, they pretty much could. So the only thing holding the collar mostly was their ears. So to get the data, we had to get the collar back. And so there was a lot of bushwhacking involved. This is the mini Glacier Valley. Here, when the collars came to us, they collected a location on the animal every 4 hours. Because that's what they used when they were collecting data on grizzly bears and wolves and other animals that were wearing these same types of collars. Well, we tried that. M1 was in this area here, and this is Mount Wynn, if you're familiar with the mini Glacier Valley. Sherburne Reservoir here, so go ahead and hit the next. And so M1 was over here. 4 hours later, he was over here. So, okay, 4 hours. So he's in Glacier County, now he's in Flathead County. So it really didn't help us much to find out what these guys were up to. So we started dialing back the time between locations. And so, go to the next one. And we eventually had to get to 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes, we got a location on these guys. And that used up a lot of battery. It used up a lot of storage on the collars. Now, of course, you know, technology's changed. You have better batteries, better storage. But anyway, this is Acorn Creek here, Continental Divide. This is Swift Current Mountain. This is where Granite Park Chalet is in this area. And this is Logan Creek leading up toward Logan Pass. So you're basically looking south. So go ahead and hit the next one. So in 5 minutes between these two, you know, 5 minutes between these yellow fields. So we were able to track him going from Acorn Creek up to the Divide, this is in winter, up to the Divide, across the shoulder of Swift Current Mountain, down by Granite Park Chalet, and then down into Logan Creek, and eventually up and over Logan Pass in January. So this gave us an opportunity to see exactly how wolverines are used in the landscape. So it was very important. We didn't know a lot of how they traveled across the landscape and the types of habitat they use. So this was very important. Another thing that it showed us was that they were using these climbing routes. This is Iceberg Notch, just above Iceberg Lake. This is winter. And they were using Iceberg Notch up and down Iceberg Notch with impunity. I mean, it was just the way they went. So it's a challenging climbing route. If anybody's been across it or seen it in the winter, I'm not going there, you know. It was, we were impressed with that kind of stuff. All these squiggles, this is the northern part of the park. Lake Sherburne's down here, the Mini Glacier Valley. This goes up into the Belly River country. This is the Canadian line right here. Alberta, British Columbia. This is M3. Our batteries lasted 8 days. So he would leave the Mini Glacier Valley with a new battery, and he would head north and go up and through Belly River, up into Alberta, Waterton Lakes National Park, up farther into Alberta, over into British Columbia. This is Kentland Lake here. This is the head of the down into the Bowman Lake drainage. And then he'd make his way back to Mini Glacier 8 days later and catch him again. And then put another battery and he did the same, different route, but still international. And another 8 days. So it was, these guys move across huge swaths of country. I mean, you couldn't walk that, I couldn't walk in 8 days. But he's also the Wolverine that some folks might have read about some years ago that climbed the east face of Mount Cleveland. So this is Mount Cleveland, the highest peak in Glacier. This is White Crow Creek here, Glens Lake. So he kind of pooped around in this area for a little while. Then he decided, you know, I'm just going to go over in Ham Creek, which is toward Goat Hunt. And he climbed this east face, 4,900 vertical feet, in 90 minutes. And that was in January. This is basically the route. This is a more wintertime view of the east face of Mount Cleveland. So I really don't know of any humans that have gone up that way. There were some folks that climbed the north face. But anyway, yes. One of the other things that the collars provided us, they had activity sensors in them. So people would ask, are wolverines active in the day and the night? So we could say yes, both. This is about 8 p.m. and there's a peak in activity here. This is over a 90-day period, so it's a very nice curve. And then this other peak in activity is about 8 or 9 in the morning. So there were peaks of activity about 12 hours apart, and then there were lulls in activity about 12 hours apart. So this is like 4 in the morning, and this is like 4 in the afternoon, 3:30, 4 in the afternoon. So yes, they sleep in the daytime, and they sleep at night, and they are active in the daytime and active at night. So this is an activity cycle for one wolverine, so it may be different for others. We're not sure about that. This is Scat. Some people call it the This is the latrine that female wolverines use at their den sites. Wolverines only den to have their young. So at these sites, there were dozens of scats. The white ones are scats that are just bones. It's just from the wolverines eating and living on bones. So if a wolf eats a carcass, they usually don't eat all the bones. But a wolverine can find bones at that and have a meal. So next one. We collected a lot of scats. And we collected scats in the wintertime, at den sites, and in the summer. It's really hard to find scats in the summertime. But we were able to have these scats analyzed for prey remains. Okay? And I don't want to get too technical, but the main takeaways here are the artiodactyls are the even-toed ungulates. Moose, elk, deer, and sheep and goats. Those are very important food resource. Not so much in the summer, but during the winter and during the denning period. And then hibernating rodents. Those are your marmots and ground squirrels and chipmunks, and those guys were more important in the summertime. It kind of makes intuitive sense. It's what other people found in other studies, the same thing. But one of the interesting things was the conifer needles. So wolverines were eating conifer needles. And we actually had some of their urine analyzed, and they had terpenes in their urine that we thought might have something to do. In this kind of shape, wolverines ate everything except the horns and the hair, basically. This is the dermal shield, very thick skin that wolverines didn't eat, but they ate everything else. This is all we could find.
How many humans have got eaten in the...
No, we didn't. Not in this study. Small mammals, important throughout the year. These little guys, the ground squirrels, especially in the spring when they come up through the snow, God, they're easy pickings, This little critter is northern bog lemming. I've never seen one in 30-some years of being in Glacier National Park. They occur there, and we found evidence of them in the Wolverine scat. So we know they're there, but what are they called? The Wolverines know they're there. Northern bog lemming. Also, these guys, you've lived around here for very long. You've probably seen these in the park. But there's cattle. We have evidence of them in Wolverine scats too. The yellow dots are where our trap sites were located, mostly on the east side of the divide. So, next one. And we can talk about the social structure of wolverines. So the males, the lighter green circles, the bigger circles, encompass the home ranges of the females, which are the reddish circles. So like this is M1's home range here. It extended on both sides of the divide, and he had 3 different females that he was dealing with. So he was fathering their young, and very little overlap between the home ranges of females and between the home ranges of the males. So that's kind of how their structure was set up. Next. And we figured based on home range sizes and the number of different wolverines that were in a particular site, that there may be 40 to 45 wolverines in the entirety of the million-acre Glacier National Park. So there may be 300 grizzly bears supposedly, but yeah, only 40, 45 wolverines. I'd like to talk a little bit about denning. Wolverines den only to have their young in the spring under about 8 to 10 feet of snow. So this is a log structure that at the time it was being used by wolverines would have been under about 8 to 10 feet of snow. So next little guys, they may be a week old or less. So wolverines have delayed implantation, like bears. And the females will breed in the summer, and they don't get pregnant until January. So depending on their condition, they may not get pregnant. But the gestation is a very, very quick 35 days, and then the kids are born in late February or early March. So they're white like this, and then they turn gray, and then they get the regular Wolverine brownish color. The den sites are right at tree line. So, you know, this den site was right in this area, right at tree line. And you didn't have to walk very far and you were above tree line. And den sites, there weren't very many ever documented prior to our study because they were very difficult to find. Even with GPS technology, if wolverines were underneath the snow, there was no location taken with the satellites because the satellites couldn't see the collar. So we had to do a lot of flying in March and April, which is a challenge in this part of the world. And we look for tracks. So these are the Wolverine tracks here. And then the next thing we look for are these holes in the snow. A lot of times these holes to den sites would be underneath trees, so you couldn't really see them from the air. But you try to get close, get on the ground, and then try to find these sites. So this is a Wolverine den structure. This is a white bark pine snag, and it didn't fall over. It grew this way. It grew along the ground because the winds are so fierce that these trees couldn't go vertical, so they went horizontal instead. There's not a lot of white bark pine that are alive that are like this in high country anymore. Okay. This is a maternal den. It's a larger structure. It's also white bark pine, much larger structure. At the time, it would have been used by wolverines. The snow would have been about where Pete Lundberg's hat is, right there. So, under 8 to 10 feet. One of our females would chew on logs and kind of create a little nest area in here on the ground for her kids. So I want to make it clear that the structures were at the ground level. The wolverines always had their kids at the ground level, but the snow was 8 feet deep. We also found dens and these room-sized boulders. That boulder might fit in this room, but yeah, that's a pretty big boulder. This is one of our volunteers here, but the Wolverine den underneath here, there's usually voids under these big boulders, and so you go through the snow and you can find a place underground. Okay. They also use caves. This is a cave that was also used by grizzly bears, or bears. I'm pretty sure it was grizzly bears, but Wolverines used it 1 year to have their kids. The elevation for all the den sites, so we found 14 different den sites. And the average elevation was about 6,200 feet. So there's this elevational band across the park that they used, and that's where all the den sites were located. So it was only 600 feet difference in that band. The snow depth, the average was about 8.5 feet. This is Grand Park Chalet in April. But deep snow, very important. Yeah. Aspect we looked at, and the aspect, this R value actually, the closer it is to 1, the less random it is. But we had den sites pretty much across the whole compass, except for southern exposure here. So a few more were in the southwest exposure, but there was no general northern exposure chosen. The structures themselves, all the log structures, the average diameter was 26 inches. So a very big log, and 55% of those were white bark pine that were dead. When the kids are 10 weeks old, they start to travel with their mother. So these guys are about 10 weeks. This is my friend Roy Anderson. He lives in Norway, and he worked on wolverines in Norway, and so these are Norwegian Wolverines. We go to the den sites at 10 weeks and we dig down through the snow and capture the kids. And we put transmitters on them. And while we were doing this, this was very labor intensive and inhumane. The female would circle, you know, while we were there and keep an eye on us. And then when we left, she would go and get the kids and take care of them. And so then we had transmitted young that we were able to track and see what their fate might be. We found that 70% of the young Wolverines didn't live to see their first birthday. So very high mortality. Glacier Park's a tough place to make a living. And we had one adult female was killed in an avalanche. We had 2 young males that were harvested. This is at a time when Montana allowed trapping. And then we had a young female fall from a cliff. This is actually her. And we had 1 male Wolverine killed by another Wolverine. We think it was his brother. And we had 1 killed by a mountain goat. And then we had 2 unknowns where all we found were transmitters. And I suspect that it was probably golden eagles that actually took those guys. So there's nothing left of the transmitter. Okay. This Wolverine was sad. He was run over by a dump truck on Poison Sun Road when they were doing the reconstruction. So that was in 2007. Anyway, we got DNA from him and stuff, but it was just kind of sad up near Logan Pass. Okay. Another important finding we had were, so the yellow is male M1, his kind of paraphernations. Female F2, she's the dark squares, and then her den sites are right here. So prior to our study, any Wolverine biologist that found a male Wolverine in the vicinity of a female's den site would say that he was there to kill the young. That's what he was going to do. We didn't find that. We found M1, came to F2's den sites, disappeared underneath the snow, was there for a half hour, an hour, and she was not there. And then when he left, he did it a couple times. When he left, the kids were fine, and we actually captured them later. So this was evidence that he was actually helping to raise his own young, which we found pretty fascinating, and it was information that hadn't been determined before. Wolverines will hang out in their, they hang out with their mother till they're about 6 months old, and then they kind of go off on their own throughout their parents' home ranges. And then when they're about a year old, or a little older, they'll potentially disperse, especially the males. This young male was in the mini glacier area here. He took off on April and went, or March it was, went to the southern whitefish range near Coconut Falls, and then we lost him from this area, but he was found again up in the Northwest Peaks area, where British Columbia, Montana, and Idaho kind of come together. And he stayed up there for 5 months or so until he was taken by a trapper. This young female, F26, she was in the Two Medicine area, just up the road, and she left there. I like to think that she came through the Badger Two Medicine area. It's good Wolverine habitat, it'd be good denning habitat, and anyway, she ended up over here in the Swan Range at the head of Bunker Creek. So, and she was there for 4 months, you know, until her transmitter went dead. So, we think that she had a successful dispersal, and hopefully her young are still roaming around the Swan Range somewhere. So, we used, go ahead and hit the next one. These are locations that we have without the travel routes. And there were areas of concentration where the Wolverines may have spent hours or days in these areas. So we'd identify these and then we'd go to those sites. Okay? And a lot of times we find we have to wait till spring. what we find where the Wolverines had found prey. This is a bighorn sheep that the only thing left was the horns and the hair. The bighorn was in this area, ended up in this area, probably in an avalanche. But the male M1 came and spent a lot of time here and carted out this sheep and hauled the parts up to this cliff band right here, and that's where he stashed the meat in wintertime. So the next slide. So this cliff band was about 20, 30 feet high, but at the time he was using it, it was covered with snow, but there's a void between the snow and the rock, and that's where he put his cache. So he'd go back there weeks later, and he'd have food that he used. This is another cluster site where there was a dead elk. This Wolverine spent 3 days at this site, 3 days right in a row. And if you go to the next one. And with the activity sensor, we were able to determine that about, go ahead, hit the next one, every 2.5 hours, he had a peak in activity. He would rest for 2.5 hours. He would feed for 2.5 hours. Then he would rest for 2.5 hours. He did that for 3 days. Sometimes when we went to the cluster sites, we didn't find anything. But we would find an area like this, which I call nooks and crannies. This one here, there was no scat, no bones, but there were times when Wolverines spent maybe a day or 2 days there. The only thing that pretty much slows Wolverines down is deep powdered snow. So this was actually a 5-foot dump that we had on the east side one winter. But 2 or 3 feet of heavy powder or light powder here is enough to slow down a Wolverine. So we found that they used these nooks and crannies at different times, probably to wait until the snow had settled some. So that brings me to a lot of people ask, what are the threats to Wolverines? Well, there are several. Like I said, they're kind of an indicator of wild country, and that pretty much goes without saying that it's a lack of development in these areas. Do they persist where there is some development of oil or minerals? Yes, you'll see Wolverines in some of those areas farther up north. But the thing I think is the greatest risk to them is climate change. Snow is very important. Cooler temperatures are very important to Wolverines. And the other thing I mentioned was, of course, the connectivity. So areas where there's snow and where there's not snow, the melting of the glaciers. This is Grinnell Glacier and Salamander Jam up there. As those glaciers melt, they'll change the microclimate. So Wolverines need cooler temperatures in the high country. Probably why they're there. So that is another threat, and another part of climate change, and of course melting snow. Everybody says, well, they'll just go higher up in elevation, or they'll go farther north. But I don't know if is that a good strategy? Can they adapt to that? I mean, if all the snows in the high country, are there structures there for them to have their young on, because there's enough food to sustain them. Next. Fire is also a big part of climate change. So we have bigger fires, and more severe fires than we've had in, ever. So, especially in the high country. This is the Reynolds Creek fire in 2015. Photo was taken from Swift Current Lookout by my friend Buck Hassan. And these plumes, those aren't clouds. These plumes of smoke, that fire burned for weeks. It burned into the high country. It took out a lot of different trees and structural material that Wolverines could have used too. So fires are a big threat, I think. The ground will come back, but it takes a long time for trees to grow in some of those areas. Some of the white bark pines, probably over 500 years old, that are now snags there. So it'll take a long time for them to come back. A few studies have been going on, but they're not hands-on research studies. Most of the work that's being done now is with cameras and camera traps and with DNA. So the DNA It's important to get DNA. DNA's come a long way since OJ. And it's a very important tool that we can use, but it doesn't give us all the answers. So that's all I have. For more information, the Wolverine Foundation is a great resource. It's got latest research and information on Wolverines throughout the world. So thank you. Yes, if the Wolverines are wild, how do we get the trackers on? Well, we captured them in the traps, and then we would drug them. I didn't have a picture of that, but we used, a drug that you would use like for doing surgery. And that would knock them out for like 40 minutes, and then we were able to put the collars on, and then they come up, and we let them. Yeah. Yes, other questions? Yeah.
I know that there's concerns with grizzly bears being genetically distinct population, and that's a very serious risk factor for long-term survival. Is that true with these isolated populations of Wolverine? Are they genetically distinct, and are they at risk if they don't connect? Are they at risk of?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes. Are Wolverines genetically distinct? That's part of the listing that the Fish and Wildlife Service talked about, is a genetically distinct population. So the first time that Wolverines were petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act, the Fish and Wildlife Service said there are plenty of them in Alaska and Canada, and so we don't need to worry about them in the lower 48. Well, they're kind of a distinct population down here. There isn't probably a lot of interchange with the northern ones, but there's also, if you kind of focus in more on these mountain populations, isolated populations, that genetic transfer across these subpopulations is very important. So yes, there is some of that genetic isolation going on, and it's important to keep that diverse. Yes, good question. Yeah.
I'm just curious on M1, when you had that green line going up to BC and back down.
Yeah.
Did you figure out how many miles that was and how much total elevation gain he did?
Well, I mean, we didn't really, but I mean, we kind of looked at where he went and everything. We could have added all that up, but I mean, when he went up Mount Cleveland, that was like, we just went, oh wow. And nothing else really mattered. Yeah.
When you found that male visiting the site of the male den, was that an isolated incident, or did you find other males with that same behavior visiting the kids?
We, for those things to kind of come together, we had to have the male collared, the female collared, and know where the dens were. So those were, it was like the perfect storm, right? It all kind of had to come together, and it came together for that. No, we didn't find it in the other instances, no. But I suspect it probably still happened because M3 was with one of his young ones that was over a year old later on, and he didn't, they didn't interact. No, he didn't eat him. So, yeah.
When you were looking for the Wolverine babies, why was she not marking them?
I think she was probably afraid of us. There was more than one of us. Why didn't the female attack us? I think because there was more than one of us, and she wanted to, she just stayed away. So I think she wanted to. If we'd have kind of fallen down or something, she probably would have. Yeah.
So the mother births them in one den and then moves them to another den?
She will. Yes, they have natal dens where they're actually birthed.
Why do they do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. They may stay in the natal den for like a month, and then a lot of times there's changes in the snowpack in April. Things start to warm up, and then there gets to be more water in the snow and that sort of thing. So we think that might have something to do with it, why they move them. But then sometimes they move them to a larger structure. It may have to do with the kids growing and needing more room. Yeah. So, yeah.
Question, another one about the dens, Rick. You said that they averaged under like 8 feet of snow,
Yep.
and yet they had pretty good structures under most of the white bark pine trees. So
Yeah.
how did they locate them? Was it just luck, or did they know?
That's a really good question, and we don't know. We don't know when they chose those den sites. Did they choose them early on when there was no snow and just go back to them, or, you know, John Squire says like lynx, they just are pregnant, and they kind of wander around, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, I gotta find somewhere, and, you know, but I don't think it's that way. They pretty much know their home range very well, and I think they have. But one thing we found, they did not use the same den sites in subsequent years. So that was kind of interesting too. Not even the same slope. You know, they would go on a different side of the mountain kind of thing. So you wonder all the things that come together for them to choose those sites. It's a very good question. Yes?
Yes, why do the Wolverines move around so much? Because that's to burn a lot of energy. Is it that their food is that scarce?
We wondered about that too, and that's another good question. We don't think it's because of the food so much, because when we were trapping, I mean, there was food available. They knew they could go there and eat pretty much any time, and, you know, we let them go. So they kind of, the young ones caught on, and they would, sometimes we just have to shut down because the young ones just kind of live there. I'm not sure why they have this insatiable need to move. I mean, they just move across great swaths of country. Scott mentioned, I had it on one of the slides, home ranges for a male in Glacier are about 200 square miles. The females are about 60 to 70 square miles. But those are small home ranges compared to the home ranges of Wolverines farther north. They'd be 2 or 3 times that size in the Yukon or Alaska. Yeah, large.
You might have said it, but at what point do the young become independent?
Usually about a year and a half to 2 years. And they're kind of independent until their first birthday, from 6 months to 1 year. They're kind of independent, they'll wander around, but then, you know, they'll follow their father's tracks to a food source. And they'll do that, they'll stay in his home range or their mom's home range too. So they're around, and so there'll be some juveniles or some adults. Yeah?
You showed a slide earlier about the resident females and resident male.
Yes.
What establishes the resident female versus the 48 Wolverines that were in Glacier Park? Like, where are the other females going, and why aren't they considered resident?
We extrapolated to get to that 40 to 45 number. So we didn't, you know, we figured on the area that this male and these females and their young took up in the central part of the park, assuming the habitat's the same throughout the park, we extrapolated that area with the area of the park and came up with that number of 40 to 45. That's, yeah, we did, unfortunately, you know, our study would have had to go on for 30 years to be able to capture all those individuals. Yeah. Yes?
Those 3 kids were white, are they all born white, and do they change?
Yes, they're all born white, yep, and they kind of turn gray, and then they turn to the colors they were at 2 weeks. Yeah. Yes?
Does the distance that they range stay consistent between summer and winter?
I think they probably range farther in the winter. You know, they come to lower elevations in the wintertime, so they're on the snow, and they'll come down into the valleys and stuff. In the summer, you don't see that so much, unless maybe they're dispersing. Yeah, I'd say in the wintertime, they're covering more ground. And in wintertime, if you've got crampons on, you can just pretty much go anywhere. Yeah.
With those numbers, why haven't they been posted or listed as endangered? What is the...
Some of it's politics, you know. I don't know if you guys keep up with the news, but there was a lot of push to get rid of the Endangered Species Act. And the Endangered Species Act has been instrumental in protecting a lot of animals and bringing them back from extinction. Yeah.
So if I understood correctly, a big part of the diet's pine needles?
The scats,
Has a lot of benefits.
a large part of the scats had pine needles in
Is
it.
there nutritional value in pine needles?
No. Not that I'm aware of.
I was just, Jim?
Yeah, it was interesting. And then if you notice on the slide too, it also had rocks and soil. Yeah, a lot of this cat. I don't know. You know, I like to say there's things just we don't know about. And that's kind of cool. Yeah. Yes, in fact.
Several hundred years ago, grizzly bears habitated the plains. Is there any evidence at all that several hundred years ago, wolverines were in the plains at all?
Yeah, there is. There, Michigan, Michigan's is pretty flat. And, I mean, that's the Wolverine state. And, there was a Wolverine shot, 5 years ago, 3 years ago in North Dakota.
Really?
And,
Okay.
they were across the northern tier. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they were there. Yeah, so, thank you guys very much, it's been a great audience.